The reality is that, again, we do not govern data well or properly. And this is going to lead to a host of problems. I often tell people a data subject access request is a penetration test of your privacy program.
Hi, everybody. This is Arlo Gilbert, co-founder and CEO of Osano, a leading data privacy management platform. And you are listening to the Privacy Insider Podcast. This show explores the past, present, and future of data privacy for privacy and business leaders alike, as well as anyone who wants to keep privacy top of mind. Well, welcome to the Privacy Insider Podcast. In the U.S., trade is in the news on our mind right now, even those who never think about trade at all. Raw materials, manufactured goods, and yes, tariffs on both of those things. But trade involves data too. Products, data transfers, and adherence to privacy and now AI laws around the globe. Following those privacy laws can make international business and trade deals easier. Ignoring them could spell disaster for a business wanting to do business in the EU or elsewhere. What are the best practices? How do businesses use privacy as a strategic advantage in trade? And how does this current global situation change things? Constantine Karbaliotis is a lawyer and expert in privacy international trade and a Canadian. That last one is important because we Americans benefit from another outside perspective. And Canada is also a thriving global trade partner. Constantine is counsel at nNovation, LLC, a boutique privacy firm in Canada. He was the privacy leader at two large multinational companies, Mercer and Symantec, and frequently writes and lectures about international privacy and data protection. And he's the only person to ever do stand-up comedy at the IAPP Global Privacy Summit, which means that he's not only the funniest man in privacy, but he's also the biggest name in privacy. Constantine, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a real delight to have you. And, we're just going to dive right into the most important topic, which is comedy, because I know that it is incredibly unusual to do stand-up. And I'm really, really excited to learn a little bit about how you ended up in here. So I just want to hear more about this comedy show and what happened and how you ended up there.
Well, the IAPP had introduced this thing, which I'm sure you're familiar with, a little big stage. And when they had first done it, they didn't have every slot filled up. So they foolishly said to me, we have a 20-minute slot that is open. Would you like to use it to talk? And I said, of course I do. Now, of course, they didn't actually ask me what I was going to talk about. So I went up and I started telling jokes. And it started with, I don't know what's funnier, that you paid to come here to listen to me tell jokes or that I paid to come and tell you jokes. And it went downhill from there. So they've never actually repeated the exercise because clearly they learned their lesson. In general, I think that the audience was amused with, the comments, a lot of just stories from the practice of, just trying to manage a privacy program in large companies. Shared pain is less painful. If you don't laugh, you cry, they say. I got people laughing over what they were crying over. So it's, again, it's a cathartic kind of approach to dealing with the stresses of privacy.
Well, not having been fortunate enough to attend that show, and I certainly won't ask you to repeat them, like, what do you exactly joke about when you get, this is a very serious crowd.
Well, yeah. One of the things I always love telling Americans is the Europeans think we're adequate. And maybe that's actually damning with faint praise, but it ties into the topic we're going to talk about, which is trade. So, there are so many different things. And of course, just telling stories from the various and sundry exciting things that employees have done with personal information, like why on earth would you use real data in a training class situation of your ex-boyfriend and his current new girlfriend to demonstrate to the class how to access a system, but it's really, again, you can only laugh at these things because otherwise you cry. And we all have these stories. And this is where I think you have to be careful, of course, to keep it relatively anonymous, protect the reputation of the guilty. But at the same time, these are always the stories. People learn from stories, and anecdotal funny stories are often the best ones. My favorite way of leading in, often, especially to people who are non-privacy, is to tell the story of the pig. So
are you going to tell us the story of the pig now? Because I'm dying to hear it.
The very important compliance story. So this guy was having this really bad day, and he decided to take a drive in his convertible through the hills. You can imagine this, maybe in California, winding road, and he's beginning to relax and feel better about life until a car goes in the other direction, and a woman sticks her head out her car and yells "pig" as she goes by. And he gets all mad and upset. He's saying, "Why is she calling me a pig? She doesn't even know me." He puts his foot on the accelerator, goes around the next curve, runs smack into a pig. And that's our job, is to tell people about the pig around the corner. They often hear that their systems are piggish or that their processes are piggish, and they're not really listening to the message, which we're trying to deliver, is that there's a pig around the corner. And unfortunately, most of the time, our job seems to be cleaning up the bacon.
I love that you're able to take such an often dry topic and make it so entertaining. Was comedy always something that was a piece of you? Was it a way to deflect? Was it something you did because you were a stand-up comedian? Like, how does this...
I don't know. I think most lawyers are frustrated actors, comedians of some form or another, and I've always said, the reason I didn't go into stand-up comedy was because everyone kept telling me to sit down. So I don't know. I think it's a way of softening messages. It's a way of, like communicating to get a message across so that, the sort of backhanded compliment was, in various trainings, I never thought privacy could be so interesting. And I'm going, oh, thank you. I've just devoted my life to this, but okay. And, but that's exactly the kind of point we also have to reach, is to get the message across, to persuade people, because we're always selling. Right? We're always selling this thing called privacy. We're educating and selling. And in my experience, where privacy people fall down is we haven't taught them that soft skill, right? They think that, these rational, logical arguments should work. Well, you don't know people then, right? Because that obviously clearly not as a winning strategy.
Yeah, we are not a rational species many times.
Yeah, no, I'm fully convinced the reason we haven't made contact with alien intelligence is that they're staying well away from us. Again, the bane of our existence is that we have to, deal with human beings. But if we understand them and we understand how to get them on board, then I think we're just more successful in our roles and we're probably less frustrated. But I like to think that I'm funny. My wife and children beg to differ frequently. I also have this audience in the background, but it doesn't stop me, clearly.
Well, you and me both. I can commiserate on my wife does not enjoy my jokes nearly as much as I do.
No.
This is so fun. I'm really enjoying the conversation already. So tell me a little bit about your background. So you're Canadian, you're funny, you're in privacy, you've held a lot of really important roles, but I'd love to know more about you as a person. Where'd you grow up? What got you into privacy? Tell me about you, because I find that that's one of the things about privacy is there's no linear path. Nobody ever woke up and said, I want to be a privacy attorney someday. Everybody ends up there through some unique set of circumstances. And I'm just dying to know what yours are.
Well, mine's a pretty circuitous path. And it's kind of interesting how when I started, it helped me end up where I am, if that makes any sense. So I grew up in Edmonton in Alberta, Western Canada. And that, for your listeners, is one of the places in the world where we know that minus 40 Celsius and minus 40 Fahrenheit are the same, because that's where the scales coincide. And it frequently reaches that temperature. So we're a very hardy group, by the way. And so I grew up there, and I was very keen on sciences and computing science, in my teens and early years. But I decided that we had more than enough technology people, and what we needed was, more law. In fact, law that governed nations, because I was convinced at that point in time, it was still the Cold War, dating myself, that again, we needed law to govern countries. And so I decided I wanted to go into international law. So I went to Queen's University at Kingston in Ontario. And, it was a great school. And I was doing transborder data flows in 1981. I went to a conference on it, and it was like the intersection of law and technology really fascinated me, because I was, really technology inclined. And so, but it's very difficult to find roles at that time in Canada in international law. So I started practicing law. A big focus. Actually, my first job was not practicing law. After my call to the bar, I was working doing expert system development for a software publisher. And that was automating legal documents and processes. So I got early on a very heavy experience in technology at a time that most lawyers were just terrified of, it didn't even have a computer on their desk. I was better known for that than I was what I was doing in law. And I was invited to join a consulting firm, a large consulting firm, and to join their practice advising law firms and legal departments on automation. So I was an IT consultant for 8 years. And one day, it's dangerous to be, between projects on the bench, as they say, because I was walking by and this project manager said, you can read a law. You're my privacy manager. And that's how it started.
That tracks. Just somebody handed it to you.
Yeah, exactly. And so I led what turned out to be a massive sort of exercise to do PIA in Ontario for the Ontario government. I got 4 ministries to agree to something, which apparently was somewhat remarkable at the time. And that's where it started. I ultimately led the security and privacy practice for this company in Toronto. I went to Symantec. I ran their global privacy program. Went to Mercer, became the chief privacy officer. I did actually also return to my roots. I worked for Nimity, leading their sales group.
Yes, Nimity, and they were acquired, right?
TrustArc, yeah.
TrustArc, that's right.
And but it was acquired after I had left. But I know things from your side because I actually, and in a sense, it was just coming back to where I had started, which was practice automation, right? But what I experienced going through, Symantec and working at Mercer was I realized, oh my God, I'm doing international law. It was the thing that I had started out to do. And now I was doing it in the area of privacy, but I was doing it. And I was helping to negotiate international agreements, dealing with international data flows, dealing with breaches that crossed borders. I was doing international law, and I still am. It was the goal at the beginning, and it was just, again, a very strange roundabout route of getting there.
I love that. And it completely maps to how we hear about most people who end up in privacy roles, which is somebody at some point in time went, you're smart and you seem like you're willing to do it. So here, you can take this. I have so many questions. One of the things you mentioned, which was this idea that we needed to have laws that governed countries. The thing that pops into my head when I hear that is Star Trek, right? Because if you look, Star Trek had the Federation. And it was extraordinarily well-oiled machine. There was very minimal conflict on Earth. Is that where you were thinking we would go?
Listen, I was a science fiction fan. I was like the geekiest, right, of geeks in my early years because I was like all into science fiction. I love Star Trek. And I love the world.
Are you a new Star Trek? Are you a Jean-Luc or a Captain Kirk?
I watched it all the way through.
Wow.
Okay. So, and I'll tell you, one of the things I found very influential, especially in the 80s, was the cyberpunk genre, which I think, unfortunately, we're now creating in real life. We'll come back to that. I think that colored a lot of my views about why I chose to do what I did, which was that it portrayed a world where we made it. We survived. We actually figured out a way to get along with one another. And we were having new adventures. And I do think that was very influential for a generation of people who thought that is possible, that we can do that.
Ray Bradbury, I mean, when you look at the things that he conceived of as being pure fiction, right? I mean, the tricorder, we're all walking around with a tricorder in our hands now. You can tell me the temperature, it can tell me the air quality on the land that I'm about to go down to.
C. Clarke had a brilliant book called, I think it was Empire Earth. And he had these, again, portable computers that everybody would use to connect, pay each other with. It was like astounding. He also had a brilliant idea that solved the political problem. And I want to repeat it to you because I think it might still be a valid one. Anybody who wants political power is the one we should least trust with it. So in his future, he had people being drafted into the job and they would be given time off for good behavior.
Interesting. I love that.
I think that's actually maybe, sensible. But again, they portrayed a world that they could see coming. And science fiction is always just about possibilities. And when you get a little bit further forward into the cyberpunk genre, William Gibson, the Blade Runner kind of, it's dystopian. It's not meant as a blueprint. Unfortunately, I think we've gone there.
It's more of a cautionary tale in those cyberpunk ones. You walk away feeling a little icky.
Like what I think captured people's attention and imagination was this idea of delving into data, that interaction directly with information. But then there was all the other stuff, which really wasn't that good. And I think that one of the reasons why I think still law and regulation is important is precisely because I see this challenge in the distribution of power, not now between states, but between the individual and large organizations. So we need to have that balance restored in some fashion. And I think that ultimately it's rules, it's rule making that's important. And it sort of leads to something that I always like to tell people about, which was a little factoid. I love collecting little stupid facts and repeating them to people, unfortunately. In 1898, there were 2 cars in the entire state of Ohio. They ran into each other. We do need rules. We do need to have rules, because even though it might seem like some things would be common sense, let's all agree to drive on one side of the road. Apparently, that's not as obvious as one would hope. So, we need rules, and we need them to be sensible. We need them to support, doing business. And of course, you can't transact anything without exchanging information. But still, there should be rules.
Yeah. I love the 2 cars in Ohio that bump into each other. There used to be a contest where they would try to see who could write the shortest science fiction story. The entire story was one sentence, and it was, the last man on Earth sat alone in a room. There was a knock on the door. And your story of these 2 cars, it's like the only 2 cars in the whole state. How is that possible if they managed to be that close to each other?
Exactly. And I read a lot of those one story ones, like one line, very short ones. I remember reading actually a collection of those. It was like, some of them were very disturbing like that, but it stretches your mind to, when you reading science fiction, writing science fiction, it makes you think about possibilities. And again, we really need that kind of thinking it's scenario playing. When we do breach, tabletops, or we look at, and analyzing whether a particular technology, what harms it could, create, we're doing scenarios, right? And this requires us to have imagination, to extend what we're thinking and play out those scenarios. So I think that science fiction fantasy is really good at stretching your mind to contemplate possibilities.
Absolutely. So I do have a couple other questions on this topic before we jump on to a little bit more topic about privacy. But on the science fiction side, I don't get a lot of science fiction fans. I also am a big science fiction fan. So, Isaac Asimov was I read everything he ever wrote.
Line. First book I read, Rocket Ship Galileo.
Oh, that was a classic.
From that point, I was done. That was it.
So you're clearly a science fiction fan, whether it's 1984, Minority Report, or, the books that we're talking about. Are there any of these stories that you look back on now and you feel were particularly foreshadowing?
William Gibson's trilogy. I think that
And for those who don't know, this is Blade Runner, Neuromancer, and what was the other one?
Overdrive. I think I can't remember the other one. And it was set in a very dystopian future, which was you either worked for one of these large corporations or you were left by the wayside, or potentially you were one of these cowboys who were the hackers, who were the go-betweens living basically on the periphery of the law. And an actual mortal danger, because hacking could actually be fatal because of ICE, the anti-intrusion measures could actually kill you because you were engaged with the data so deeply. And so it was a very interesting sort of world. It really, I think, rocked science fiction when this started coming out. And I think that the reason it was so engaging was his vision of interacting with data in this way. And it really presaged a lot of, I think, where we're going with AI, where we're going with the power that analytics has, and definitely with the concentration of power in relation to large organizations over data. I want to make a t-shirt that says, it's the data dummy. It's the data. And because it's only the data that we need to really be thinking about these days.
And I assume this is a reference to the line from American Politics, it's the economy, stupid.
The data is the economy. That's what people have missed, right? And this is, again, circles back to what we're going to be talking about in relation to trade. And, so I do think that not the failure to understand how significant the fourth industrial revolution is, that this is a data-based change in our underlying economic system, and understanding the control over that is really the fundamental issue that we're facing today. And again, why rules are so important.
So are you going to let Elon put a Neuralink in your brain?
Heck no.
Let's talk about privacy.
Okay.
You talked about the early 80s and getting involved in, international law and having exposure to data. I got to be honest, in the 80s, what kind of international data trade and transfers even existed?
Well, there was already a concern from the US that privacy laws, which were being introduced in the Nordic countries, would be a non-tariff barrier to trade. Because what was clearly, even though it was mainframes, there was a recognition that there was going to be a centralization of data in countries which had that capability. And so the US felt that under the guise of privacy laws, they were trying to prevent, data from being housed in large data centers, principally in the US. So you see, this is still the issue, right? This has not gone away. And, so it started then, but it also encompassed things like, well, with satellites, you could know in the US, based on looking at, from satellites, whether a third world country's crop was going to fail or not. And the notion that that information shouldn't be denied to them because it's their country after all. So a lot of these issues were, being looked at in the early 80s. And that's when the OECD came up with a framework in order to ensure that the rules went with the data. I mean, that's my summary. The rules must go with the data. So, that you protect information, but at the same time, of course, the OECD's role to facilitate the free flow of data. And this has always been my perspective, is that the rules should flow with the data. We should be able to create trusted environments in which, again, we can use the capabilities that are offered by tech companies or whomever, wherever they are, with trust. And I think that's the principal reason that we've seen, that principles-based law, the development of the internet, all of the things that we've seen since that time have been based on this notion of there will be a free flow of data. And I think that's being challenged right now.
Yeah, walled gardens, international borders. It seems like that free flow of data, commerce, and countries have recognized that the data is valuable and it needs to be controlled in the same way that they control energy and oil and, all the other things that countries produce. When you think about, you mentioned that the Nordic countries were storing data in their data centers, and the U.S. ended up viewing this as being a potential trade issue. And I think that's so fascinating in the context of what we're talking about today. But before we jump into the trade topic, I'm super interested in understanding what happened. So the 80s, the Nordic countries are doing this. Was there a result? I mean, did we go and enact new trade legislation to try and answer that? Or did we wise up and recognize that countries have to store their own data?
Well, it wasn't so much that they were storing their own data. They wanted, again, rules to apply to the data. And so the OECD framework was a response to this to ensure that there could be trusted transfers. And I think that opened up a lot of trade in services. And so what we saw was an expansion over the years. And of course, in the 90s, the personal computer became much more prevalent. And then finally, the internet exploded. There was, however, a reaction to the fears or concerns about how this information was going to be used because the EU passed the Privacy Directive in 1996. And Canada's response, which was PIPEDA, the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, was done primarily to facilitate the free flow of data between Europe and Canada. We got adequacy. That's the joke earlier, remember? So we got an adequacy recognition. I think, partly was also to sort of slap America upside the head and say, look, the Canadians can do it. You ultimately settled on the safe harbor framework. And we know what happened to that. And it was replaced by Privacy Shield. Schrems 1, Schrems 2, Privacy Shield gets knocked down, US data transfer framework. All of these were mechanisms to try to, again, address the concerns of how data is accessible and usable in its flow between countries. We want to ensure the rules flow with the data. Where everything falls down is that while this works on private sector organizations, it's never been effective against the US government, which always has the ability to look at information. Under the Biden administration, they were beginning to close the, sort of loopholes that would allow for mass surveillance and so on, and give redress mechanisms so that the European Commission was comfortable in accepting the EU-US data framework. Now, again, we're back to potentially, maybe a Schrems 3, because we may not actually see that survive because there's been changes now being made to the supports for that framework.
Interesting. And you mentioned, the law needs to follow the data. I think everybody would agree with that now. That might have been controversial back then, but now I think we've all arrived at the same conclusion. I'm curious how you think about, when you think about legislation, it's almost always in the rearview mirror, right? It's kind of like, well, this thing happened and now we're going to enact policy in order to prevent that from happening again and to come up with a better plan. Do you think that the law can follow data, or is the law always going to be so far behind just because of the process of establishing new law, getting consensus, getting it passed? Do you think we have a possibility of having legislation and general broad rules that are well prepared to evolve? Like we've seen GDPR, excellent law, forward thinking in many regards, but it did not factor in the consideration of AI. Right. And so then you find yourself going, well, you can't get consent for use with AI because nobody knows what you're going to do with it. Gosh, now we got to write a new law. I'm curious whether you think there's any possibility of a brighter future when it comes to regulation and being more forward thinking.
I do. And I think that there are mechanisms that are actually set out in the GDPR, which does apply to AI, but you're right. There's obviously other areas of concern that the EU AI Act has been developed to address. The thing that I think we need to think about is how rules are actually made. And of course, legislation is hard to get done. I mean, we had a proposal to change our national privacy law that failed because we went to an election. And so it died on the order paper. PIPEDA's been in place since 2001. Okay. The internet really wasn't a thing then. And when it was drafted, and now we have AI. So really, it is a principles-based law. It still has got some flexibility, but people want certainty. They want rules, right? To know what to follow, what side of the road to be on. And the reality is that legislation is always like that. But if you get too prescriptive, and that's the concern that, many people have, is it becomes prescriptive, it becomes inhibiting to innovation. So there is a model, and it was proposed in our legislation under Bill C-27 to create what's called codes of practice. Now, this is also a feature of GDPR, but it's very difficult to get 27 member countries to agree to a single code of practice. There's only been a couple that have been successful. Okay, putting that aside for a moment. Codes of practice are subordinate rulemaking. They can be more flexible. You could change it on a yearly basis.
It's true.
So this is
a good principles-based law with that level of autonomy by the agencies.
Right. Or even industry-developed codes, co-regulation that could work to be much more flexible in terms of how organizations, have to comply with the law, but do so in a much more agile basis. And I think is going to have to be the way we're going to have to move. We have to think about rulemaking. This is the start of the conversation, was that we need more rules, but we need the right kind of rule making in order for us to have that agility, but at the same time, do the right things vis-a-vis consumers, individuals, and so on.
Do the right thing. That's our mantra. I love that. Yeah, I think that that's ultimately something that a lot of people forget, is that these laws are there to serve us as citizens of the world or citizens of our country or state. I really, really love that mindset. Let's talk about privacy. Let's talk about trade, because this is your area of expertise. I'm really interested to think about how privacy and trade intersect and where they conflict, but also really fascinated to understand your views on this new, tariff-laden world. And do you imagine that there are any challenges coming, or perhaps any silver linings here that we're not expecting? I would love to hear your thoughts on trade and privacy in general.
Well, as I said, data goes with trade. And even if you're just getting contact information from a European company, you still have to comply with GDPR. But it's rarely just that, right? What's changed, I think, in the last 5 years for most North American companies is they've realized that in order to make their revenue targets, they have to actually do the right thing vis-a-vis privacy. And I think that's a big mindset change that's very important. It's been very difficult to persuade management around compliance. They don't get really excited about that. When you talk about revenue, though, boy, do they get interested. And what's happening is that their customers are demanding that they don't drag them into a nightmare situation, right? Don't make privacy problems for us. So you'll see that every agreement now has a data protection addendum. Well, you've got to actually live up to those promises, don't you? That's when you make your way to the privacy office and say, oh, we've been ignoring you the last 5 years, but now we need your help. How fast can you fix this, right? Our privacy law in Canada is the responsibility of innovation, science, and economic development. It's a trade issue. It supports trade. There's the cross-border privacy rules, which is the Global Privacy Rules Forum has been initiated to take the APEC CBPR and expand it. And why? Because it facilitates trade. So again, we need to know that we're dealing with trusted parties. This is now a B2B issue. And that, again, brings us back to revenue. You've got to show you've got the right controls in place and you can live up to them. And so that's the connection. It's very simple. You will have to actually do these things now if you want to make your revenue targets. So there is impacts with what's been happening. Well, a lot of the focus in the trade war at this stage has been on goods. And it sort of is missing that a lot of that in supportive for the trade in goods still requires data to go back and forth, right? And so if you want to expand your markets, and that is something that the Canadian government, for instance, is encouraging Canadian companies to do right now because of the concerns about the tariff barriers that they may be facing with the US, they're now encouraging companies to think about cross-border privacy rules and how to align with these requirements so that we can expand our business. That's simple. And for US companies, it's going to become a little bit more challenging because as these other changes in your administration is bringing in terms of undermining some of the EU-US data privacy framework, it's going to get harder for US companies to demonstrate that they're able to honor the commitments that they're making. It is very much a concern for every European. I once, in one of my roles, was being raked over the coals by an English solicitor because of the NSA. And I was going, I'm a Canadian. I don't know why you're giving me trouble about it. And we were able to work it out.
Did he think that stood for North American security?
I don't really think he was tweaking into we're not America. Anyway, we have this continuing problem with multiple parties now. The thing that we managed to get him over was, okay, if we don't really need the names of the individuals, we can just simply assign a random number. And suddenly we've anonymized it in our hands. And then everything was better. So I think what organizations have got to do if they want to find preserve their business, but also increase it, is find ways to address these concerns using technology, administrative measures, all that, what's GDPR, technical organizational administrative measures. Because Schrems 2 was very clear in the decision that contract alone is not enough. The standard contractual clauses are not enough. You need to have those other mechanisms to demonstrate that you've got the right controls in place, that you can honor your commitments. So this is where privacy people are really essential. We're the glue between law and technology. We have to help make those controls meaningful so that we can give the confidence to our business partners that the right controls are in place. We can honor our agreements. So I think that is the real challenge now for US businesses, to be creative in thinking about how to offset or augment the privacy protections. It may mean it's encrypted, I can't see it. It's zero knowledge. And that may be the satisfactory way to solve some problems. In other situations, it may be de-identification, tokenization. Other strategies can be applied to minimize the risk, but to mitigate it so that, again, your business partners are comfortable. And I think that's going to be generally the direction we're going to have to go. While earlier it was about the free flow of data, increasingly now it's about assuring, again, our business partners that the rules actually flow with the data.
When you think, it's interesting. So, when I look at the technology ecosystem as it's evolved over the last, call it 30 years, right? I think of that window as being the real commercial internet that we are all familiar with, right? It kind of started mid-90s-ish as if you were, I don't know what you had in Canada, but in America, we had all these AOL CDs that would get sent out to you. And I assume you had CompuServe in Canada. That's a blast from the past. So, one of the things that's interesting is, we look at the evolution of kind of internet technology in general and how businesses tended to use it, right? So in the beginning, it was, we're going to stand up a website and we're going to maybe see if we can do a brochure for the products that we offer online. And they lived in usually a single server that they probably owned or leased, right? There wasn't really any data there that could be exfiltrated or transferred. And then we saw this shift towards the cloud and AWS's, but we saw a real drumbeat of collect as much information as you can at every given moment in a customer journey. Store it forever because you just don't know when you might want to use it, right? Or there might be value that So we did a very good, not we, but we royally did a very good job as a society of convincing businesses that they needed to store this and essentially become the hoarders of the world, right? But now we're going to them and going, actually, turns out not the best plan, right? So there's this legal framework side of it, but there's also, I think, a fairly significant part of just getting the momentum that was established over the last 30 years of collect, and convincing people that you don't need to collect. You should collect what you need, and you should be clear about it, and you should store it for how long you want to store it. When you're out talking to clients, when you're engaging in, with regulators, is this a problem we can solve?
Yes. Okay. But the problem is we've built a house on sand. And I will say I was speaking at the ARMA New York event at the beginning of March in New York. And I was talking about the intersection of privacy, data retention, and AI. And the reason that this was the topic that they asked me to speak about was, of course, they're at the forefront of managing information management, retention. We have built our house on sand because we don't know. We over-collected. I got your name, your mother's maiden name, your shoe size, your favorite color is blue, this sort of thing. And without any sort of notion of why we were collecting it. And it sort of undermines this whole notion of lawful basis, right? We have to have a reason for collecting information. It's principle of Canadian law as well. Limit how much you collect to what you need to fulfill the business purpose. Anything else, you really need to either get consent or you have to have some other legal justification. So That's a principle that's, being into articulated in fact, in US state laws now is, data minimization. Okay, so we built this house on sand because we got all this data. We don't know where we got it from or what basis we got it from. And now we're pouring it into AIs. And we're creating a huge information governance problem for ourselves because we still don't have that connection to why did we collect this information in the first place? What was its provenance? What was its quality? Should we still have it? I also get laughs at conferences, sometimes inadvertently, so it's not always stand up. I ask, how many people have our data retention policy? And everyone puts up their hand. And I go, okay, how many of you are complying with it? Everyone just laughed. They're not. And, why are you living in, this world where your retention policy doesn't mean anything? A German company was fined for not complying with their data retention policy. It didn't have a breach, but access requests will expose these things. Oh, if you do have a breach, it will definitely expose that you've had information about this person for 20 years, longer than you should have. So, and then you start asking, well, should this information have now been populated into your AI training model? Maybe you didn't have a legitimate basis for doing that. So I think that, what I'm trying to get at is, you put your finger on the heart of a very fundamental problem, is that we are lousy at data governance. And we've been doing it for 30 years. And now we're going to have to pay the piper because now it's possible to actually find out through access requests, through breaches, through the training models themselves, through AI, what information organizations have. Should they have it? It also, I think, raises other questions about, is it biased? Amazon created a database, an AI to vet engineers' resumes and found that they couldn't rescue it because it was trained solely on the data of male engineers. So it discriminated against women and they could not fix it. Okay. Bad data, garbage in, garbage out kind of stuff. If the data is old, talking to people during the pandemic in the travel industry, everything that was beforehand was meaningless during the pandemic. Right? And all of your statistics during the pandemic, are they meaningful now? We don't ask the question, what's the quality of the information? So retention rules exist to help us get rid of the old when it's no longer valid or useful.
It's not a topic. Retention is not something you see a lot of enforcement activity around, right? We see a lot more enforcement activity around those visible things. Oh, you didn't have the right consent banner, you put too much friction in your opt-out process. But it doesn't feel like the regulators often go behind the scenes to ask the question of, are you doing what you say you're doing?
Well, until there's a breach. Every breach is multiplied by a factor of 3 to 5 by virtue of the fact that nobody got rid of anything. And then you see the consequences. Then you can actually articulate what the cost is of over-retention. And that's when, commissioners in Canada, state attorney generals do get excited about retention because they can say, why do you have this data from 20 years ago? Your breach multiplied by that much and you can quantify it. So I do think that when we start now bringing this back into the AI world, we're going to start asking the question, is the data that you are, training, like you said, we just glommed all this information in. Is it something you legitimately should have had when your own retention policy said, you can see this is where you're going to be hoisted by your own petard?
You're going to have to translate several of those words for me, by the way.
Yeah, it's not an expression I get to use terribly often, so I jumped on the possibility. And so I have a vocabulary, I will use it. So the point I'm trying to make is that, everyone has documented their retention policy and is just waiting there for some litigation lawyer to go, oh, so this is what you said you were going to do, but you haven't been doing it.
Yeah.
That's my translation of hoist by your own petard. So the reality is that, again, we do not govern data well or properly. And this is going to lead to a host of problems. I often tell people a data subject access request is a penetration test of your privacy program.
Ooh, I'm going to steal that, by the way. I like that. That's a very good phrase.
You can always just give me credit, but, steal. But, it is. You're going to find out these things based on the responses, if they're honest, as to what information you have about an individual. And it'll also tell you how well that they actually you're performing in terms of responding to them, how accurate you are, because they often have lots of communications from you, and they can say, well, I know you know this about me, but why didn't you say so in your data subject access request response?
Yeah.
So, it is a great opportunity, and there are businesses evolving around, like automating these and becoming agents. I have to admire the United States, very innovative in terms of its opportunities to use litigation as a industry. We're not quite so litigious in Canada, but there's still class actions here. But at the same time, you guys blow us away. I've often said the biggest danger to any U.S. company is the tactical nuclear lawyer. So I think that this is also perhaps a way to get this across to management, is to say, this is why you need good information or data governance. This limits your liability. This is going to come out. The truth will out. That's the other thing I think that people begin to fail to understand with all of the tools and things that we're putting into play, is that it's going to be so much faster and better to actually find all the smoking guns that you've got hidden back in the storeroom of data. So, I do think that there is going to be a reckoning for all of that massive data collection.
Yes, I would agree with you on that. And, the class thing is interesting because, although we have had historically weak privacy regulations in the United States and a significant absence of federal enforcement of the majority of those, because, look, we have privacy laws here. We just don't enforce them. So they may as well not exist in many, many cases. But when you look at those classes, the class actions, right? In many ways, what we see is that those class actions are a much bigger motivator for businesses to comply with the regulation than the threat of the, call it 1 in 100,000 chance that a regulator comes knocking on their door, because the odds are much higher that you will get sued in America.
And I think that there's another aspect of that can't be ignored, which is shareholder actions. When you mess up, many companies fail to sort of connect, is that this is not only the subject of personal rights, consumer rights, it is also the asset of the company. If people treated money the way they treat data, a lot of people would be fired. We haven't made the connection mentally that data is an asset of the company. So you're going to start seeing, and you have seen shareholder actions, which when companies have had data breaches or they've gotten in trouble with regulators, that, have gone right to the heart of, you are mismanaging this asset and you are bringing down the value of our shares because of that. Directors' liability, greater, enforcement by the SEC in relation to cyber breaches. All of these things really come back to, again, governance, information governance, which ultimately has to go to the boards of directors. So they don't actually ask the right questions right now. 90% of US public companies have InfoSec and privacy related issues reporting to the audit committee. The audit committee,
wow,
right? So they're not knowledgeable. The board's role has got to be to ask the right questions of management. And if it's not capable of doing that, then the question is, are they doing their job? I think in relation to, again, the information age and what we're experiencing today in terms of transition to this fourth industrial revolution suggests to me that a lot of the governance frameworks we have around data just don't exist and are inadequate. So this is where I think litigation is going to be a very big driver for change, because it's going to hold management and boards accountable for how information is being managed.
That's brilliant, by the way. Shareholder actions is not something that many people talk about and think about in privacy. You think about the class litigators, you think about the regulators, but you're right, SEC level type of things. And
it's been very, very difficult to get harms established in many class proceedings. And it's often simply the threat and the costs associated with which causes settlements. But America has a long history with shareholder actions.
Yeah, we do. And they're always dramatic. So, look, you are in a country that, as you've described, is adequate. And, the concept there is that, Canada has put itself in a really nice place where you've become this trusted place that, Europeans can confidently have their data stored, Americans can have their data stored. And so in many ways, to butcher the phrase, you've become the Switzerland of data privacy in the kind of the northern North American region. So when you look at the US, we think about adequate, or the Canadian take on privacy, right? Appropriate and reasonable, I think is what you mentioned at one point. When you think about the US and you think about our approach to privacy, do you think it's reasonable, appropriate? I mean, what should we be doing here that we're not doing?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that, the states are doing a lot in terms of creating rules. The problem is that, and I'm not telling Americans anything new, this patchwork is really challenging, right? So a good, strong federal privacy law would be really helpful. Part of my role has always been to explain America to Europeans and, say they don't care about privacy. Oh, you have never met the FTC, have you? So we know it's not true, right? And Europeans have trouble understanding the American framework because it's like a zillion laws, right? You've got sectoral laws. You don't have a central privacy commissioner or, data protection authority. So it's very hard. Well, I mean, it's very hard for American companies to navigate this. Imagine what it's like for Europeans to try to figure it out. I think that ultimately there's a couple of things you can do from the private sector regulation side. You used to have these things that I always admired in law school, which was these uniform codes, or model sort of laws, which states would model and nobody's done this in privacy, which I find really frustrating because it would simplify things. Everybody can have their own law, maybe with a few variations, and they say that's the advantage Canadian provincial and federal laws have, is they're based on largely the same principles. We never have this kind of real fundamental challenge between how things are being done. Quebec is a little bit of a different case because it's a civil code jurisdiction, but still, we largely approach things the same way. I think that what would help would be obviously a federal law, but you've got to satisfy California and other jurisdictions that it's not going to be less than, right? I'm not sure that the brilliant minds in the United States have tried to figure this out. And, it really requires bipartisan support in your Congress. And good luck to you.
If we had done this 10 years ago, we would have a wonderful federal privacy law, but we dragged our feet. And as a result, the states had to take action. And now we're in this sticky situation.
And I will say that there is one other fundamental issue right now, and this relates to the trade war. And that we haven't talked about services yet, but that's going to get dragged in. The US has a surplus with most countries in relation to services. So that's not being accounted for in the overall, deficit surplus conversation. But it is increasingly a focus of countries outside, not just Canada, but Europe, elsewhere, that this is of concern now because of the storage of data within the United States. And so there's questions of data residency and data sovereignty being raised. And this threatens that whole notion that I talked about earlier of the free flow of data. And I don't have an answer for you in this because fundamentally it means reestablishing trust. It all comes back to that equation of trust. And, if, for instance, someone says we're willing to pull the plug on fighter jets software, then the natural next question that gets raised is, well, how far will that go? Will our services that we may have a data center of a US company in Canada, but are we able to trust that? And the question is being raised by Canadians and by Europeans because of the trade war. So there is some really, I think, existential concerns right now to this notion of the free flow of data. And they can only be addressed by reestablishing trust.
Which we're not in a great position to do today, unfortunately. And, as was it George W. Bush had said, fool me once, shame on you, fool me, and you can't get fooled again. I think that's what he said. The phrase is supposed to be much more eloquent, but it does feel like as an American looking at how the rest of the world must view us, it's got to feel a little bit like working with somebody who's got, schizophrenia, right? I mean, in the sense that You go, okay, great. We felt like we had some rational partners that were prepared to work forward towards a solution that would happen. And then now you got a new administration who's got a totally different viewpoint on it, and they're going to go the opposite direction. And then we get another administration who goes and seems normal and reasonable and wants to work and cooperate. And then we go back to another administration. I'm curious, what do you think we have to do as a nation to reestablish trust with our trade partners? Let's go ahead and just assume we're talking about 4 years from now that we have that opportunity, because it doesn't look like it's going to happen right now.
I'm going to start with where I started, the rule of law. We have to have laws that govern nations and agreements between. Part of the problem that Europe has had that required the, Privacy Shield, Safe Harbor, the data framework, has been that there's no agreement about what friends will do to other friends, about, spying, about, surveillance. We need agreements. We need that United Federation of Planets approach, confirming that we can trust one another. It's return to the rule of law. The real problem is going to be reestablishing that trust. Our prime minister, who was just recently reelected, has said, our relationship will never be the same. That's a very shocking and hard thing to hear from our prime minister. It's hard, but it's not wrong. He said what we're all feeling. And there's a real sense, I think, in Canada of a grieving over a loss of a friend.
Yeah.
And I don't think that should be underestimated, but we have to move on.
Yeah.
And, we have to survive in this new world, and it's going to be tough for everybody. And we can only hope that the course will be changed at some point in the future. But right now, because of these whipsaws, we have to move on.
Yeah, I mean, look, if we had a corporation that, 1 year was up and the next year was down, 1 year was up and the next year was down, you couldn't buy from them. You couldn't invest in their stock. And, it does feel like we are creating problems for ourselves here. Well, Constantine, this has been really wonderful. I'd love to understand. We always like to talk a little bit here about, I'm a privacy pro, and you've got such deep, interesting thoughts. You're a very funny person. Is there anything you do that you wouldn't tell other people that they should do?
I use probably technology a little bit too liberally when it comes to my Amazon devices. I love telling it to do things. Tell me, I really annoy my family with tell me a dad joke, because at dinner time, because they're awful. They're really awful. Amazon does not have a sense of humor. I just love the scenes of pain expressed across their faces. And, I listen to music and I like automation. I love to use automation. I drive my wife crazy because I know when she's, left the house, because I have a monitor on the door, the garage door, mostly for security reasons. But where are you going?
And you have a consent notice on the door, I'm sure, that says I'm collecting this data.
No. My kids go, you've created a surveillance. I said, my first assignment, my son just, finished his degree and he wants to do some work with me. And I said, okay, the first thing you can do then is a PIA of the house. So he's going to, oh yeah, Dad, we're definitely doing that. So
that is awesome. Well, Constantine, thank you for joining us today. This has been a really delightful conversation. And for folks who have been listening today, please go take a look at nNovation LLP. This is the law firm where Constantine spends the bulk of his time these days. You can find them online. It's 2 N's. It's nNovation. And they're excellent. So if you need any help in Canada or with global trade issues related to privacy, we can't speak highly enough of you and your firm. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Privacy Insider Podcast. You can find a full transcript of this episode and any show notes at osano.com. That's www.osano.com. And while you're there, get access to an excerpt of my book, The Privacy Insider: How to Embrace Data Privacy and Join the Next Wave of Trusted Brands, which is now available on Amazon for purchase. Until next month, take care. And remember, data privacy is a fundamental human right, y'all.